The emergency alert pierced through Denver International Airport's terminal like a knife. Flight 447 to Phoenix sat grounded, engines silent, while passengers crammed into uncomfortable plastic seats. But when the airline crew desperately needed someone who could handle a crisis that threatened national security, they never expected the solution to come from the quiet woman in the navy blazer who'd been serving coffee just minutes before. What happened next would leave an entire airport speechless and force everyone to question everything they thought they knew about the person sitting right next to them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of March 15th started like any other Tuesday at Gate B12. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight attendant uniform one final time before stepping onto Continental Flight 447, bound for Phoenix Sky Harbor. At 34, she'd perfected the art of the professional smile, the one that could diffuse angry passengers and make crying children forget their fears. Her auburn hair was pulled back in the regulation style, not a strand out of place, and her posture carried the confidence that came from years of managing chaos 30,000 feet above ground. The Boeing 737 was packed to capacity with the usual mix of business travelers, families heading to spring training, and college students returning from break. Sarah moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking seat belts, stowing oversized carry-ons, and answering the same questions she'd heard thousands of times before. Her colleague, Rebecca Chun, worked the opposite aisle with similar precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Continental Flight 447 with service to Phoenix," Sarah announced over the intercom, her voice carrying the warm authority that came naturally after 12 years in commercial aviation. "We'll be departing shortly, and our flight time today will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. Everything seemed routine until Captain James Rodriguez's voice crackled through the cabin, communication system with an edge Sarah had never heard before. "Sarah, I need you in the cockpit immediately." She exchanged a quick glance with Rebecca, who raised an eyebrow but continued her pre-flight duties. Sarah made her way forward, past the first-class passengers who barely looked up from their laptops and phones. The cockpit door stood slightly ajar, which immediately struck her as unusual. "What's the situation, Captain?" Sarah asked as she stepped into the cramped space where Rodriguez and First Officer Michael Sullivan sat surrounded by blinking instruments and radio chatter. Rodriguez turned in his seat, his weathered face grave. "We've got a problem. Air traffic control just informed us of a potential security threat. There's been chatter intercepted about a possible incident involving a commercial flight departing Denver this morning." Sullivan nodded grimly. "The FBI is scrambling to verify the threat, but until they give us clearance, we're grounded indefinitely. They're asking all airlines to review their passenger manifests and crew assignments." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. In her years of flying, she'd dealt with medical emergencies, severe turbulence, and even a few unruly passengers, but nothing involving national security. "How can I help?" "We need to keep the passengers calm while security conducts additional screening," Rodriguez explained. "But here's the complicated part. They're asking for detailed background information on all crew members. Standard procedure, they said, but they want it fast." The captain handed her a clipboard with forms that looked far more complex than anything she'd seen in routine airline paperwork. As Sarah scanned the documents, her eyes caught on a section that made her pause. The forms were requesting military service records, security clearances, and specialized training certifications. "Captain," she said slowly, "these aren't standard airline security forms." Rodriguez nodded. "That's what's concerning me. Whatever's happening, it's bigger than a typical security scare." The FBI agent I spoke with mentioned they might need crew members with specific qualifications to assist with the situation. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see unusual activity on the tarmac. Black SUVs had positioned themselves around several aircraft, and personnel in dark suits were moving with purpose between the terminal and various planes. This wasn't the standard security theater passengers were accustomed to seeing. "I'll handle the passenger announcement," Sarah offered, but Rodriguez shook his head. "Actually, they want to speak with each crew member individually first." Something about matching qualifications to the situation. He handed her a business card with a simple phone number. "Agent Patricia Vasquez. She's coordinating from the terminal." Sarah took the card, noting the weight of the stock and the absence of any agency logo. Professional, discreet, and slightly ominous. "Should I be concerned?" "Honestly, I don't know what to think," Rodriguez admitted. "In 23 years of flying, I've never seen anything quite like this." As Sarah made her way back through the cabin, she noticed the subtle changes that indicated growing passenger frustration. Phones were coming out, conversations were getting louder, and the businessman in 3A was already demanding to speak with someone in charge. The college students in the back were starting to get restless, and the family with young children in row 15 was dealing with increasingly cranky kids. Rebecca intercepted her near the galley. "What's going on up there?" "The passengers are starting to ask questions." "Security delay," Sarah replied, keeping her voice low. "Could be a while. I need to make a call, but can you start the extended ground delay service? Get the snacks and drinks going, maybe put on a movie for the kids." Rebecca nodded, already reaching for the service cart. She'd been flying long enough to recognize when a routine delay was anything but routine. Sarah found a quiet corner near the boarding door and dialed the number on Agent Vasquez's card. The phone rang only once before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Agent Vasquez speaking. This is Sarah Mitchell, lead flight attendant on Continental 447. Captain Rodriguez asked me to call. Ms. Mitchell, thank you for calling promptly. I need to ask you some questions, and I need completely honest answers. The situation we're dealing with requires personnel with very specific qualifications." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of qualifications?" "Military experience, particularly aviation-related. Security clearances. Specialized training in crisis management or emergency response. Any background that goes beyond standard commercial airline training." The questions hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had spent 12 years carefully constructing her identity as simply Sarah Mitchell, flight attendant, resident of suburban Denver, weekend yoga enthusiast, and volunteer at the local animal shelter. It was a comfortable, unremarkable life that she'd built deliberately. But Agent Vasquez was asking about a different Sarah Mitchell entirely. "Ms. Mitchell? Are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here." Sarah took a deep breath. "What exactly is the nature of the threat?" "I can't provide those details over an unsecured line, but I can tell you that we may need someone with combat aviation experience to assist with a situation that could affect national security. Do you have any background that might be relevant?" The weight of the question settled over Sarah like a familiar burden she'd thought she'd left behind. Through the small aircraft window, she could see more government vehicles arriving, their occupants moving with the kind of coordinated urgency that brought back memories she'd worked hard to suppress. "Agent Vasquez," Sarah said carefully, "if I provide you with my background information, I need assurance that this conversation remains classified and that my current employment won't be affected." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Mitchell, are you telling me you have relevant experience?" Sarah closed her eyes, knowing that her next words would change everything. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, but my call sign used to be Phoenix. I flew F-16s for 8 years before transitioning to commercial aviation." The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Agent Vasquez spoke, her voice carrying a new level of respect and urgency. Double quotes, "Ms. Mitchell, Phoenix, I need you to remain exactly where you are. I'm sending someone to escort you to a secure location immediately." We have a situation that may require your specific expertise. What kind of situation? The kind where a former Air Force pilot currently working as a flight attendant might be the only person in Denver with the qualifications we need to prevent a catastrophe. As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that the carefully constructed life she'd built was about to collide head-on with the one she'd left behind. Around her, passengers continued their complaints about the delayed flight, completely unaware that the woman they'd been dismissively calling just the flight attendant was about to step back into a world where split-second decisions could determine the fate of thousands. The irony wasn't lost on her that after 8 years of avoiding anything related to her military service, she was about to discover that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. It comes looking for you at 34,000 feet, or in this case, while grounded at Gate B12 in Denver International Airport. Rebecca appeared at her elbow, looking concerned. "Sarah, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah managed a weak smile. "Something like that. Rebecca, I need you to take over passenger services. I'm going to be tied up with security for a while. Is everything all right?" Sarah looked out at the tarmac where more official vehicles were arriving by the minute, their occupants moving with purpose toward the terminal. In a few minutes, her two worlds would collide in a way she'd never anticipated. "I honestly don't know," she replied, straightening her shoulders in a gesture that had nothing to do with airline protocol and everything to do with the military bearing she'd never quite lost. "But I have a feeling we're all about to find out." Agent Patricia Vasquez arrived at Gate B12 within minutes, accompanied by two other officials whose credentials Sarah couldn't quite make out from a distance. Vasquez was a compact woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and an air of controlled intensity that Sarah recognized immediately, the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "Ms. Mitchell." Vasquez approached with measured steps, her voice low enough that nearby passengers wouldn't overhear. "We need to talk privately. There's been a development." Sarah followed the agent through a series of restricted access corridors that most passengers never saw, past maintenance areas and administrative offices. They entered a conference room that had been hastily converted into a command center, complete with multiple laptops, secure communication equipment, and wall-mounted monitors displaying what appeared to be real-time flight tracking data. "Please, sit down." Vasquez gestured to a chair across from a table laden with documents. "Before we begin, I need to verify your identity and clearance status." Sarah reached into her wallet and produced her driver's license, but Vasquez shook her head. "I mean your military identification and security clearance documentation. I don't carry those anymore," Sarah replied. "I separated from the Air Force 8 years ago." One of Vasquez's colleagues, a tall man with premature gray hair, looked up from his laptop. "Major Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, service number 4,487,392. Separated October 2016 with full honors. Last assignment, 388th Fighter Wing at Hill Air Force Base, Utah. Security clearance. Top secret. Currently inactive but eligible for immediate reactivation." The casual recitation of her military record sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "How did you access that information so quickly?" "Ms. Mitchell," Vasquez leaned forward, "we've been monitoring potential threats to aviation security for the past 6 months. When we ran background checks on all crew members for flights departing Denver this morning, your profile flagged our system immediately. A former fighter pilot working as a commercial flight attendant isn't exactly common." The gray-haired man introduced himself as Colonel David Harrison, though he wore civilian clothes. "Phoenix, I served with your old squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Walsh. She speaks very highly of your capabilities." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever her military service was mentioned unexpectedly. "Colonel Harrison, with respect, I've been out of the cockpit for 8 years. Whatever situation you're dealing with, I'm sure there are active duty pilots better qualified to help. Under normal circumstances, you'd be absolutely right," Harrison replied, pulling up a classified briefing document on his laptop screen. "But these aren't normal circumstances." Vasquez took over the explanation. 3 hours ago, NORAD detected an unidentified aircraft that appeared briefly on radar over the Rocky Mountains before disappearing again. The aircraft's flight characteristics suggest advanced stealth capabilities, potentially foreign military technology. 47 minutes ago, Harrison continued, we intercepted communications, suggesting that this aircraft may be planning to intercept Air Force One during the President's scheduled flight from Colorado Springs to Washington later today. Sarah's blood ran cold. Air Force One is flying today. The President concluded an economic summit in Colorado Springs early this morning. His departure was scheduled for 1400 hours, but we've moved it up to 1230 hours as a precautionary measure. Vasquez pulled up a map on one of the wall monitors. Here's where it gets complicated. The unidentified aircraft was last detected here, approximately 50 miles northeast of Denver. Air Force One's flight path will take it directly through this airspace. We have F-22 scrambling from Peterson Air Force Base, Harrison added. But there's a problem. The suspected threat aircraft has been using civilian flight corridors and appears to have sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. It's been spoofing transponder codes and radar signatures. Sarah studied the map, her tactical training automatically analyzing flight patterns and potential intercept courses. What does any of this have to do with me? You have active military assets responding. Because, Vasquez said quietly, the aircraft was last detected using the transponder code for continental flight. 447 your flight. The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. Sarah stared at the map, pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to form a troubling picture. Someone is using our flight as cover, she said slowly. More than that, Harrison replied. We believe someone has been planning this operation specifically around the commercial flight schedules from Denver today. Your aircraft, along with 3 others, provides perfect cover for an attack aircraft to approach. Air Force One, undetected. Vasquez opened a thick folder containing photographs and technical specifications. The threat aircraft appears to be a modified civilian jet with military-grade avionics and possibly weapons systems. It's been shadowing commercial flights, using their radar signatures to mask its approach. Sarah examined the photographs, her pilot's eye immediately catching details that others might miss. These modifications aren't amateur work. Someone with serious military aviation experience planned this. Exactly, Harrison nodded. Which brings us to why we need your help. Our F-22 pilots are excellent, but they're trained for air-to-air combat against military targets. This situation requires someone who understands both civilian aviation procedures and military tactics. The threat aircraft has been using commercial aviation communication frequencies and following civilian flight patterns, Vasquez explained. We need someone who can think like both a military pilot and a commercial aviator to predict its next moves. Sarah stood up and paced to the window, looking out at the tarmac where her own aircraft sat surrounded by security vehicles. What exactly are you asking me to do? We're asking you to help us coordinate the response, Harrison replied. Your unique background gives you insights that pure military pilots might miss. You understand commercial aviation patterns, civilian airport operations, and you have the tactical training to anticipate military-style attack strategies. Additionally, Vasquez added, we may need you to communicate directly with the threat aircraft if it continues using commercial aviation frequencies. A voice they'll recognize as legitimate civilian air traffic might be our best chance of gathering intelligence. Sarah turned back to face them. And if I refuse? Then Air Force One flies its scheduled route with F-22 escorts. And we hope our conventional response is sufficient, Harrison said frankly. But given the sophistication of this threat, we'd prefer having every possible advantage. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah like the G-forces she'd experienced pulling tight turns in her F-16. For 8 years, she'd deliberately distanced herself from anything related to military aviation, building a quiet civilian life that felt safe and predictable. Now, that carefully constructed world was colliding with the reality that some skills, once learned, carry a permanent responsibility. If I agree to help, Sarah said carefully, what would my role be exactly? You'd work directly with our tactical team to analyze the threat aircraft's behavior and predict its likely attack vectors, Vasquez explained. You'd also serve as a liaison between our military response units and civilian air traffic control. Harrison opened another laptop and showed her real-time tracking data. We've established a secure communication link with Air Force One and the F-22 squadrons. You'd have access to all intelligence as it develops. Sarah studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating intercept courses, fuel consumption rates, and timing factors. Despite 8 years away from military aviation, the analytical processes came back with startling clarity. What's the current status of Air Force One? She asked. Still on the ground at Peterson, but they're accelerating their departure timeline, Vasquez replied. The President's security detail wants to get airborne before the threat can establish a better attack position. That might be exactly the wrong move, Sarah said, her tactical instincts taking over. If the threat aircraft is already positioned along the planned flight route, rushing the departure could play directly into their strategy. Harrison and Vasquez exchanged glances. Explain. Sarah moved to the map display and began tracing flight paths with her finger. Look at the timing. The unidentified aircraft was detected here at approximately 0900 hours. Air Force One's original departure was scheduled for 1400. That's a 5-hour window, more than enough time for the threat to establish multiple potential intercept positions. She continued her analysis. But if you move the departure up to 1230, you're actually reducing the President's strategic options. The threat aircraft can simply adjust its position and attack earlier in the flight path, where Air Force One has less maneuvering room. Vasquez was taking notes rapidly. What would you recommend? Delay the departure, not accelerate it, Sarah said without hesitation. Force the threat aircraft to maintain its position longer, which increases the chances of detection. Meanwhile, use the extra time to flood the airspace with additional commercial flights as cover for military assets. Harrison was already reaching for a secure phone. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. Phoenix, will you help us? Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who were asking her to step back into a world she'd worked hard to leave behind. But as she studied the tactical displays and considered the implications of the threat, she realized that some responsibilities transcended personal comfort zones. Colonel Harrison, she said, straightening her shoulders in a gesture that belonged more to Major Mitchell than to Flight Attendant Sarah, reactivate my security clearance. I'm back in. The transformation was subtle but immediate. The professional demeanor she'd maintained as a commercial flight attendant shifted into something harder, more focused. Agent Vasquez noticed it immediately. The change from civilian service worker to military officer happened in the space of a single decision. Good, Harrison said, already working his phone. Your clearance reactivation is already in process. We anticipated you'd agree to help. Sarah raised an eyebrow. That confident? Phoenix, Vasquez said with the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her. Pilots like you don't just walk away from protecting people. You might change careers, but you don't change who you are. As if summoned by the moment, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. Passengers getting restless. How much longer? Sarah looked at the message, then at the tactical displays showing an unidentified threat aircraft, potentially targeting the President of the United States. In a few hours, her biggest concern had been managing cranky passengers on a delayed flight to Phoenix. Now she was being asked to help prevent what could be an attack on Air Force One. Agent Vasquez, she said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. I'm going to need someone to handle my flight duties. This is going to take a while. Already arranged, Vasquez replied. We've told your captain that you're assisting with a security matter. Your colleague Rebecca will manage passenger services with support from airport personnel. Sarah nodded, then asked the question that had been nagging at her since the briefing began. How did you know I'd say yes? Colonel Harrison closed his laptop and looked at her directly. Because 8 years ago, when you separated from the Air Force, your commanding officer noted in your file that you were leaving for personal reasons, but that you remained committed to protecting American lives. Today, American lives are at risk. Some commitments don't have expiration dates. The truth of that statement settled over Sarah like the weight of wings she'd thought she'd folded forever. Outside the conference room, she could hear the normal sounds of airport operations, passengers boarding flights, baggage carts rolling past, announcements echoing through terminals. It was the ordinary world she'd chosen to inhabit, but inside this room, surrounded by tactical displays and classified briefings, she was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, flight attendant. She was Major Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, and people were counting on her to help prevent a disaster that could change the course of history. Question now was whether 8 years of serving coffee and managing passenger complaints had dulled the edge that once made her one of the Air Force's most trusted pilots. In a few hours, she'd find out if Phoenix could still fly. The secure communications room hummed with activity as Sarah found herself at the center of a multi-agency operation that spanned 3 time zones. Within 30 minutes of her agreement to help, her temporary security clearance had been reactivated, and she'd been briefed on classified intelligence that painted a far more complex picture than she'd initially understood. Phoenix, take a look at this, Colonel Harrison called from his workstation, where multiple screens displayed real-time satellite imagery. We've identified 3 potential threat aircraft, not just one. Sarah moved to his position, her eyes quickly adapting to read the tactical displays that had once been as familiar as her own reflection. The satellite feed showed aircraft positions across a 200-mile radius, with commercial flights marked in blue and military assets in green. 3 aircraft showed up as amber unconfirmed status. All 3 were detected using transponder codes that match legitimate commercial flights, Harrison explained. But their flight patterns suggest coordinated movement. Agent Vasquez joined them at the display. The communications intercepts we've been monitoring suggest this is more than a lone wolf operation. Someone has been planning this for months, possibly years. Sarah traced the flight paths on the screen with her finger, her tactical mind processing the information with the same systematic approach she'd used when analyzing enemy aircraft movements over combat zones. These aren't random positions. Look at the timing intervals between their appearances on radar. She pointed to timestamps on each detection. Aircraft Alpha appeared at 0847 hours, Bravo at 0923 hours, Charlie at 0958 hours. That's 36-minute intervals, exactly the separation you'd want to establish overlapping coverage zones without creating radar interference between your own aircraft. Meaning? Vasquez asked. Meaning we're dealing with professional military planning, Sarah replied. This is a coordinated attack formation designed to provide multiple intercept opportunities against a single high-value target. Colonel Harrison was already on a secure line to NORAD. General Morrison? We have confirmation of a coordinated threat. 3 aircraft minimum. Professionally coordinated attack pattern. While Harrison briefed his superiors, Sarah continued studying the display. Something about the flight patterns bothered her, a detail that didn't fit the standard military attack profile she'd expect from foreign adversaries. "Agent Vasquez," she said slowly, "what do we know about the origins of these aircraft?" "Very little. They seem to appear and disappear from radar coverage at will, suggesting advanced electronic countermeasures." Sarah pulled up a different view on the display, showing commercial flight schedules for the entire Rocky Mountain region. But they're using legitimate transponder codes from actual commercial flights. That means someone has access to real-time airline scheduling and aircraft identification systems. The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Vasquez's expression darkened. "You're suggesting this might be a domestic threat." "I'm suggesting that whoever planned this operation has access to information that would be extremely difficult for foreign adversaries to obtain," Sarah replied carefully. "FAA, transponder codes, real-time flight schedules, detailed knowledge of Air Force, One security protocols. This looks like an inside job." Colonel Harrison ended his call and returned to their discussion. "NORAD is scrambling additional 22 squadrons from 3 air bases. We'll have 12 aircraft providing coverage within 90 minutes. Colonel," Sarah said, "before we commit military assets, I think we need to consider the possibility that we're walking into a trap." Harrison's expression grew serious. "Explain." Sarah moved to a whiteboard and began sketching out her analysis. "Standard military doctrine for a coordinated air attack involves establishing multiple approach vectors to divide the defender's resources. But look at these positions." She marked the 3 aircraft locations. "They're not trying to divide our forces, they're trying to concentrate them." She drew arrows showing potential F-22 intercept courses. "If we send fighters to engage all 3 threat aircraft simultaneously, we create a massive furball of military aircraft in exactly the airspace that Air Force One needs to transit." Vasquez was taking rapid notes. "You think they want us to flood the area with our own fighters?" "I think they're counting on it," Sarah replied. "In a chaotic air engagement with multiple friendly and hostile aircraft, it becomes much easier to mask the approach of the real threat." Harrison studied her tactical analysis. "So what do you recommend?" Sarah capped the marker and stepped back from the whiteboard. "We don't take the bait. Instead of sending 12 F-22s to engage 3 targets, we send 2 highly skilled pilots to shadow the threat aircraft at maximum detection range. Meanwhile, we establish a clean corridor for Air Force One using a completely different flight path. The President's security detail won't approve a route change at this point," Vasquez objected. "Too many variables, too many new security risks. Then we make the current route secure by eliminating the variables," Sarah replied. "But we do it surgically, not with overwhelming force." Colonel Harrison was already reaching for his secure phone again. "I need to brief this up the chain immediately. Phoenix, can you put together a detailed tactical plan? Give me 20 minutes and access to current weather data, fuel calculations, and Air Force One's performance specifications." As Harrison stepped away to make his calls, Vasquez moved closer to Sarah. "You seem very confident for someone who's been out of military aviation for 8 years." Sarah looked up from the display she was studying. "Agent Vasquez, flying fighters is like riding a bicycle. You never really forget. But tactical thinking is different. That's like playing chess. The more complex the game becomes, the more important it is to think several moves ahead. And what moves do you see coming?" Sarah's expression grew grim. "I see someone who spent a lot of time studying how we respond to aerial threats. They know our standard operating procedures, our command structure, and our typical reaction times. This isn't just an attack, it's a chess match against an opponent who's been watching us play for a very long time." Her secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. "Major Mitchell." The voice on the other end was electronically distorted. but clearly spoke with American accent. "Phoenix, it's been a long time." Sarah's blood ran cold. She gestured frantically to Vasquez, who immediately began working to trace the call. "Who is this?" "Someone who remembers when you were the best stick-and-rudder pilot in the 388th Fighter Wing, before you decided to serve coffee instead of your country. What do you want?" "I want you to stay out of this, Phoenix. You walked away from the military for a reason. Don't make the mistake of walking back in." The line went dead. Vasquez looked up from her tracing equipment. The call came through multiple relay points, but it originated from somewhere within a 50-mile radius of Denver. Sarah stared at the phone, her mind racing. "Someone just made this personal. You recognize the voice?" "No, but they clearly know me. And they know my call sign." Sarah began pacing the small room. "This changes everything. They're not just targeting Air Force One, they're targeting me specifically." Colonel Harrison returned from his briefing. "An ORD approves your tactical recommendation. We're scaling back to minimal force engagement, and..." He stopped mid-sentence, noting the tension in the room. "What happened?" "The threat just called Phoenix directly," Vasquez explained. "Someone with personal knowledge of her military service." Harrison's expression hardened. "We need to consider the possibility that Major Mitchell has been specifically targeted for recruitment or elimination as part of this operation." Sarah continued her analysis, but now with the added dimension of personal threat. "If they wanted to recruit me, they wouldn't have made threats. If they wanted to eliminate me, they had 8 years to do it quietly. This call serves a different purpose." "Which is?" Vasquez asked. "Psychological warfare. They want me to doubt myself, to second-guess my tactical recommendations." Sarah turned back to the tactical display. "Which means my analysis is probably correct, and they're worried about it." She pointed to the screen showing the 3 threat aircraft. "Colonel, I need real-time positioning updates on all 3 aircraft. If I'm right about their intentions, they should start moving into final attack positions within the next hour." Harrison established a direct link to NORAD's tracking systems. "You'll have continuous updates." "What else do you need?" "I need to talk to the pilot of Air Force One. If we're going to execute a tactical route change, the aircraft commander needs to understand exactly what we're asking him to do." Vasquez was already working her communications equipment. "I can establish a secure link, but it'll take a few minutes." While they waited for the connection, Sarah continued studying the threat aircraft positions. Something about their movement patterns triggered a memory from her combat training, a specific tactical formation she'd encountered in war games years earlier. "Colonel Harrison," she said slowly, "what do we know about recent Air Force personnel who might have separated from service under unusual circumstances?" "That's a very broad question, Phoenix. Why?" "Because the tactical formation these aircraft are using isn't foreign military doctrine. It's an advanced American air combat technique called Trinity formation, something we only taught to our most elite fighter pilots." Harrison's face went pale. Trinity formation was classified. Very few people would have knowledge of that tactical approach. Sarah nodded grimly. "And all of them would be Americans with top-level security clearances and intimate knowledge of our defensive systems." The secure communication system crackled to life, and a crisp military voice came through the speakers. "This is Colonel Michael Torres, Aircraft Commander of Air Force One. I understand we have a situation requiring tactical consultation." Sarah keyed her microphone. "Colonel Torres, this is Major Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix. I'm coordinating a threat assessment for your mission today." "Phoenix?" Torres's voice carried a note of recognition. "Phoenix from the 388th? I thought you separated years ago." "I did, sir. But circumstances have brought me back into the fight." "Good to have you back in the game, Phoenix. What's the tactical situation?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who were counting on her analysis to prevent a catastrophe. Through the window, She could see her commercial airline uniform hanging on a chair, a reminder of the quiet life she'd built and was now risking. But as she prepared to brief the pilot of Air Force One on a threat that could change the course of American history, Sarah Mitchell realized that some responsibilities never really end. They just wait for the moment when they're needed most. "Colonel Torres," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her way back to exactly where she belonged. "We have a complex tactical situation that requires immediate coordination between military and civilian aviation assets. Here's what we're facing." As she began her briefing, Sarah caught her reflection in the darkened window of the communications room. The woman looking back at her was no longer just a flight attendant who had once been a pilot. She was Major Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, and she was about to discover whether 8 years of civilian life had dulled the edge that once made her one of America's most trusted defenders. The tactical briefing with Air Force One's pilot had been interrupted by an urgent development that changed everything Sarah thought she understood about the threat they were facing. Agent Vasquez burst into the communications room with a laptop displaying intercepted radio transmissions that had been decoded just minutes earlier. "Phoenix, we have a problem," Vasquez announced, setting the laptop on the central table. "The ENSA intercepted these communications 18 minutes ago. The threat isn't what we thought." Sarah studied the decoded transmissions, her expression growing increasingly grave as she read. The intercepted messages revealed coordination between ground-based operatives and the airborne threats. But more disturbing was the timeline they outlined. "They're not planning to attack Air Force One during flight," Sarah said, looking up from the screen. "They're planning to attack during takeoff." Colonel Harrison moved her read over her shoulder. "Peterson Air Force Base is one of the most secure installations in the country." "How could they possibly?" "Because they don't need to penetrate base security," Sarah interrupted, her tactical mind rapidly processing the implications. "They need to be in position along the departure corridor when Air Force One becomes airborne." She moved to the large tactical display and began tracing potential attack vectors. "Look at Peterson's runway configuration and standard departure procedures. Air Force One will be most vulnerable during the first 90 seconds after takeoff, when it's climbing through lower altitudes and can't yet utilize its full defensive capabilities." Vasquez pulled up satellite imagery of Peterson Air Force Base and the surrounding terrain. The intercepted communications referenced something called Falcon Strike. "Any idea what that might mean?" Sarah's face went white. "Falcon Strike was a theoretical attack scenario we studied during advanced tactical training. It was designed to demonstrate vulnerabilities in VIP aircraft protection during takeoff and initial climb phases." "Theoretical?" Harrison asked. "It was never meant to be implemented." The scenario was so effective that it was classified and removed from training curricula after just 6 months. Sarah began rapidly calculating distances and timing factors on the display. If someone is actually implementing Falcon Strike, they have access to highly classified Air Force tactical studies. The secure communication system activated, and Colonel Torres's voice came through clearly. "Phoenix, we're receiving updated intelligence suggesting our departure timeline may be compromised. Can you confirm?" Sarah keyed her microphone immediately. "Affirmative, Colonel Torres. The threat has knowledge of your standard departure procedures and is positioning accordingly. We need to discuss alternative options." "What kind of alternatives?" Sarah looked around the room at Harrison and Vasquez, both of whom nodded their approval for her to proceed with tactical recommendations that would normally require much higher authorization. "Sir, I recommend implementing Emergency Protocol 7, Sarah said, referring to a classified departure procedure she hoped Torres would recognize. There was a long pause before Torres responded. "Phoenix, Protocol 7 hasn't been used since the Berlin crisis. Are you certain the threat level justifies that level of deviation from standard procedures?" "Colonel," Someone is implementing a Falcon strike scenario against your aircraft. Protocol 7 may be our only option to ensure mission success. Another pause, followed by the sound of Torres conferring with someone else aboard Air Force One. When he returned, his voice carried a new level of urgency. Phoenix, the President's security detail needs detailed justification for Protocol 7 implementation. Can you provide tactical analysis supporting that recommendation? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would influence decisions that could affect national security at the highest levels. Sir, based on current intelligence, the hostile forces have positioned 3 aircraft along your planned departure corridor. They've demonstrated knowledge of classified Air Force tactical procedures and have coordinated their attack to exploit known vulnerabilities in VIP aircraft protection. She continued her briefing, her voice growing more confident as she settled back into the role of military tactician. Protocol 7 eliminates their positional advantage by utilizing an unpredictable departure sequence that doesn't conform to any standard procedure they could have studied or anticipated. Understood. Phoenix, we're implementing Protocol 7 immediately. What support do you need for coordination? I need direct communication with Peterson's air traffic control and immediate clearance to coordinate with civilian aviation authorities. Protocol 7 requires precise timing with commercial aircraft movements. As Sarah established the additional communication links, Vasquez pulled her aside. What exactly is Protocol 7? It's a deception tactic, Sarah explained quietly. Instead of Air Force One departing on schedule with maximum security fanfare, we create multiple false departure scenarios using decoy aircraft while the real Air Force One departs from an alternate location at an unexpected time. Harrison overheard and looked concerned. That's an incredibly complex operation to coordinate on short notice, which is exactly why it works, Sarah replied. The hostile forces have planned their attack based on predictable procedures. Protocol 7 removes predictability from the equation. Her tactical display updated with real-time positions of all aircraft in the region. The 3 threat aircraft had moved closer to Peterson Air Force Base, confirming Sarah's analysis that they were positioning for a takeoff attack rather than an in-flight intercept. Agent Vasquez, Sarah said, studying the new positions, I need you to coordinate with Denver International, Colorado Springs Municipal, and Pueblo Memorial airports. We're going to need synchronized departure slots for the deception to work. How many aircraft are we talking about? Minimum of 6 decoy flights, all departing within a 30-minute window and following flight, paths that could reasonably be mistaken for Air Force One until they're well clear of the threat zone. Vasquez was already working multiple phone lines. This is going to require coordination with the FAA at the national level. Already in progress, Harrison announced, holding up his secure phone. I have Director Morrison from NORAD coordinating with FAA headquarters. Sarah's regular cell phone rang. Rebecca calling from the grounded Continental flight. She answered quickly, trying to maintain her cover as a flight attendant dealing with a security delay. Sarah, passengers are getting really upset, Rebecca said. We've been on the ground for over 3 hours now, and people are demanding explanations. I know it's difficult, Rebecca. How are supplies holding up? We're running low on snacks and the bathrooms are becoming an issue. When do you think we'll get clearance to depart? Sarah looked around the Tactical Operations Center, where military officers and federal agents were coordinating one of the most complex aviation security operations in recent history. It's going to be a while longer. Do whatever you can to keep people comfortable. Sarah, are you okay? You sound different. For a moment, Sarah felt the weight of living in 2 completely different worlds simultaneously. To Rebecca and the passengers on Flight 447, she was just a flight attendant dealing with an extended ground delay. To the people in this room, She was a military officer helping prevent a potential attack on the President of the United States. "I'm fine, Rebecca. Just dealing with a lot of bureaucracy. I'll be back as soon as I can." After ending the call, Sarah returned her attention to the tactical situation. The threat aircraft had maintained their positions, suggesting they were waiting for Air Force One's scheduled departure time. "Colonel Torres," she called over the secure communication system. "What's your current status on Protocol 7 implementation?" "We're moving to the alternate departure location now. Decoy aircraft will begin their departure sequence in approximately 45 minutes. Sarah checked the timeline on her tactical display. "Sir, be advised that the hostile aircraft appear to be maintaining attack positions consistent with your original departure schedule. This suggests they may not yet be aware of the protocol change." "Copy that, Phoenix. How long do we need to maintain the deception?" "Once the decoy aircraft are airborne and clear of the threat zone, you'll have approximately 20 minutes to execute your actual departure before the hostile forces realize they've been misdirected." Harrison received an update through his headset and turned to Sarah with a concerned expression. "Phoenix, we have a new development. The FBI has identified the source of the threatening phone call you received earlier." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "And?" "The call originated from someone with legitimate access to Peterson Air Force Base." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. Not only were they dealing with sophisticated external threats, but there was potentially someone inside Peterson providing real-time intelligence to the hostile forces. "Colonel Torres," she immediately keyed her radio. "Be advised that the threat may have access to real-time intelligence from within Peterson. You need to assume that your communications and movements may be compromised." "Understood, Phoenix. We're implementing additional communication security measures immediately." Vasquez looked up from her coordination efforts. "Phoenix, I have all civilian airports standing by for the deception operation. But we need to know if there's a mole inside Peterson. How do we prevent them from compromising Protocol 7? Sarah stared at the tactical display, watching the positions of friendly and hostile aircraft scattered across hundreds of miles of airspace. The chess game had just become exponentially more complex. "We don't prevent them from compromising it," she said slowly, a new strategy forming in her mind. "We use their inside access against them." Harrison and Vasquez both turned to look at her. "Explain." Sarah moved to the whiteboard and began sketching out a new tactical approach. "If there's a mole inside Peterson feeding information to the hostile forces, then we feed them information we want them to have." She drew multiple aircraft positions and flight paths. "We implement Protocol 7 exactly as planned, but we also create a false Protocol 7, a fake deception operation that we deliberately allow the mole to discover and report." "A deception within a deception," Vasquez said, beginning to understand. "Exactly. The hostile forces will think they've uncovered our real plan when they've actually uncovered our fake plan. Meanwhile, the real Protocol 7 proceeds with genuine secrecy." Harrison was nodding slowly. "It's complicated enough to work, but it's also complicated enough to fail catastrophically if we make any mistakes." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who were trusting her tactical judgment with decisions that could affect the safety of the president and the stability of the nation. Through the window, she could see ordinary travelers moving through the airport, completely unaware that their country's security hung in the balance. "Colonel Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had made the transition from civilian flight attendant back to military officer. "Complicated situations require complicated solutions. And sometimes, the most complicated solution is also the safest one." As she prepared to coordinate the most complex aviation deception operation she'd ever been involved in, Sarah realized that her years of managing difficult passengers and unexpected flight complications had actually prepared her well for managing the chaos of military tactical operations. The difference was that instead of dealing with complaints about delayed flights and uncomfortable seats, she was now dealing with threats to national security and presidential safety. But the fundamental skill, set staying calm under pressure, thinking several steps ahead, and coordinating multiple moving parts toward a successful outcome, was remarkably similar. Colonel Torres. She keyed her radio one final time before implementing the deception. Phoenix is coordinating final tactical preparations. Execute Protocol 7 on my mark. As Sarah began the countdown to what could be either a brilliant tactical success or a catastrophic failure, she caught her reflection once more in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her was no longer struggling with the conflict between her civilian and military identities. She was Major Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, and she was about to remind everyone, including herself, exactly why she'd once been considered one of the Air Force's most valuable pilots. The first phase of Protocol 7 began with surgical precision at exactly 11:47 hours. Sarah watched from the Tactical Operations Center as 6 different aircraft, 2 military transports, 3 civilian jets commandeered by federal authorities, and 1 actual commercial flight that had volunteered for the operation, began their carefully choreographed departures from airports across Colorado. Decoy Alpha is airborne from Peterson, Colonel Harrison announced, monitoring the secure military frequency. Decoy Bravo departing Colorado Springs Municipal in 90 seconds. Sarah tracked each aircraft on the main display, her eyes constantly shifting between the decoy flights and the positions of the 3 threat aircraft. So far, the hostile forces hadn't moved from their established positions, suggesting they were still expecting Air Force One to follow its original departure schedule. Phoenix, Agent Vasquez called from her communication station. We're receiving increased radio chatter on civilian aviation frequencies. Someone is trying to identify which aircraft might be carrying the president. That's expected, Sarah replied, adjusting the tactical display to show radio transmission origins. But notice they're not using military frequencies to coordinate. They're still trying to maintain the appearance of civilian aircraft operations. Her analysis was interrupted by an urgent call on her secure line. Major Mitchell, this is Captain Amanda Rodriguez from the 21st Space Wing at Peterson. We have a situation. Sarah put the call on speaker so Harrison and Vasquez could monitor. Go ahead, Captain. Ma'am, we've identified the source of the intelligence leak. Technical Sergeant Marcus Webb, in our communications section, has been making unauthorized transmissions to external parties. He's been arrested, but we need to assume that our current operational security has been compromised. Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. If Webb had been feeding information to the hostile forces, they might already know about Protocol 7. Captain Rodriguez, what level of access did Sergeant Webb have to current operations? Full access to communication logs, flight schedules, and tactical coordination frequencies. Ma'am, if he's been reporting our activities, the hostile forces may know about the decoy operations. Sarah looked at the tactical display showing the carefully orchestrated deception they'd spent hours planning. If the enemy knew it was a deception, 6 aircraft full of federal agents and military personnel were flying directly into a trap. Colonel Harrison, she said, her voice tight with controlled urgency, we need to recall all decoy aircraft immediately. Phoenix, if we abort the deceptions now, Air Force One loses its window for secure departure, Harrison replied. The President's security detail won't approve another delay. Sarah studied the positions of the threat aircraft, looking for any indication that they'd moved in response to the decoy departures. Wait, something's not right. She pulled up a different view showing the timeline of Webb's arrest versus the departure schedule of the decoy aircraft. Captain Rodriguez, when exactly was Sergeant Webb taken into custody? 17 minutes ago, ma'am. Just after the first decoy aircraft became airborne, Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Colonel Harrison, the threat aircraft haven't moved to intercept any of our decoy flights. If they knew about Protocol 7, they should have repositioned by now. Vasquez looked up from her monitoring station. What are you thinking, Phoenix? I'm thinking Sergeant Webb might not have been working for the people we assumed he was working for. Sarah began pulling up communication logs on her terminal. What if Webb was feeding information to a different group entirely? Harrison moved to look over her shoulder as she analyzed the data. You think there are multiple threat groups operating independently? I think we may have uncovered a separate espionage operation that has nothing to do with today's attack on Air Force One. Sarah highlighted patterns in Webb's communication logs. Look at the timing and frequency of his transmissions. This suggests long-term intelligence gathering, not real-time tactical coordination. Her secure phone rang with another call from Colonel Torres aboard Air Force One. Phoenix, we're receiving conflicting intelligence reports. Can you clarify the current threat assessment? Sarah took a deep breath, realizing that her next decision would determine whether they proceeded with a complex deception operation that might no longer be necessary, or whether they scrapped everything and started over with less than an hour before the president needed to depart. Colonel Torres, stand by for an updated tactical assessment. She muted the call and turned to Harrison and Vasquez. We have two choices. We can assume Webb compromised our operations and abort everything. Or we can assume Webb was involved in a separate intelligence operation and proceed with Protocol 7 as planned. What's your recommendation? Harrison asked. Sarah looked at the tactical display showing the threat aircraft maintaining their original positions, despite the decoy flights now airborne across Colorado. The enemy aircraft haven't reacted to our deceptions. That tells me either they don't know about Protocol 7, or they're waiting for something else entirely. She unmuted her call with Air Force One. Colonel Torres, recommend proceeding with Protocol 7 as planned. The deception appears to be holding. Understood, Phoenix. We're moving to final departure position now. As Sarah coordinated the final phase of the deception, her civilian phone rang again. This time it wasn't Rebecca, it was a number she didn't recognize. Major Mitchell. The electronically distorted voice from her earlier call spoke again. You're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. Sarah immediately signaled to Vasquez to begin tracing the call while keeping the unknown caller on the line. I thought I told you I wasn't interested in your advice. You did. But circumstances have changed. Your little deception operation is about to get a lot of innocent people killed. What are you talking about? The 3 aircraft you've been tracking aren't attack aircraft. Major, they're surveillance platforms monitoring a completely different threat that you haven't identified yet. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her tactical assumptions. Explain. The real attack is going to come from something you can't see on radar. Something that doesn't show up on your satellite imagery. And something that your elaborate deception operation has just made significantly more dangerous. The line went dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone while alarms began sounding throughout the Tactical Operations Center. Phoenix, Colonel Harrison called urgently. We're receiving reports of an unidentified aircraft approaching Denver International Airport at extremely low altitude. It's not showing up on radar, but ground spotters have visual confirmation. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. While they'd been focused on the 3 aircraft using sophisticated electronic warfare to mask their positions, someone else had been approaching using old-fashioned terrain masking, flying so low that radar couldn't detect them. Agent Vasquez, she called. What's the current status of my Flight Continental 447? Vasquez checked her monitoring station. Still grounded at Gate B12 with passengers aboard. Why? Sarah's mind raced through the tactical possibilities. If someone was approaching Denver International Airport using terrain masking, they weren't planning to attack Air Force One at Peterson. They were planning to use civilian aircraft as cover for a different kind of attack entirely. Colonel Harrison, we need to evacuate Denver International immediately. The real threat isn't targeting Air Force One during departure, it's targeting civilian aircraft to create a distraction. Phoenix, that's a massive operation. We can't evacuate an entire airport based on speculation. It's not speculation. Sarah replied, her tactical training providing grim clarity. Think about it. What's the one thing that would force Air Force One to delay its departure and remain vulnerable at Peterson longer? The realization hit both Harrison and Vasquez simultaneously. A terrorist attack on civilian aircraft would require an immediate presidential response, potentially keeping Air Force One on the ground where the original 3 aircraft could execute their planned attack. It's a 2-phase operation. Sarah continued. Phase 1. Attack civilian targets to create chaos and force Air Force One to remain at Peterson. Phase 2. Attack Air Force One while it's grounded and responding to the civilian crisis. Colonel Torres's voice crackled through the secure communications. Phoenix, we're receiving reports of suspicious activity at Denver International. Are we proceeding with departure? Sarah looked around the Tactical Operations Center, where federal agents and military officers were rapidly reassessing a threat that had just become exponentially more complex. Through the window, she could see her own airline uniform hanging where she'd left it hours earlier, a reminder of the civilian world that was now directly in the crosshairs. Colonel Torres, she keyed her radio, recommended immediate departure regardless of civilian situation. Do not allow events at Denver International to delay your mission. Understood, Phoenix. But be advised, if there's an attack on civilian aircraft, the President will want to coordinate the response personally. Sir, respectfully, that's exactly what the hostile forces are counting on. Sarah turned to Harrison and Vasquez with a look of grim determination. We need to split our resources. Continue Protocol 7 to ensure Air Force One's safe departure, but simultaneously coordinate civilian aircraft evacuation at Denver International. Phoenix, Vasquez said. That's asking federal agencies to manage 2 major crises simultaneously. Sarah looked at the tactical display showing the approaching unidentified aircraft that threatened hundreds of civilian lives, including the passengers on her own flight who were still sitting at Gate B12 waiting for a routine departure to Phoenix. Agent Vasquez, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made the complete transition from civilian flight attendant to military tactician. Sometimes being in command means managing multiple crises simultaneously. That's why they train us to think under pressure. As she began coordinating the most complex multi-phase operation of her career, Sarah realized that her unique background combining military tactical training with intimate knowledge of civilian aviation operations had prepared her for exactly this kind of unprecedented crisis. Question now was whether her years of managing passenger complaints and flight delays had given her the skills necessary to save both the President of the United States and hundreds of innocent civilians from what appeared to be a brilliantly orchestrated attack designed to exploit the gap between military and civilian aviation security. Colonel Torres, she keyed her radio as the final phase of the operation began. Phoenix coordinating dual-phase response. Execute immediate departure while we handle the civilian situation. As Air Force One began its carefully concealed departure sequence, and Denver International Airport prepared for emergency evacuation procedures, Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of the most complex aviation crisis in American history. And for the first time since putting on a flight attendant uniform 8 years earlier, she felt completely certain she was exactly where she belonged. The emergency evacuation of Denver International Airport began at exactly 12:03 hours, just as the unidentified aircraft broke through the final ridgeline and became visible to ground controllers. Sarah watched the tactical display with growing dread as she realized the approaching aircraft was heading directly toward Gate B12, where Continental Flight 447 sat, with 157 passengers still aboard, including her colleague Rebecca. All aircraft. This is Denver Tower declaring emergency conditions. The air traffic controller's voice crackled through the communication system. Unidentified aircraft approaching from the southwest. All ground traffic cease movement immediately. Sarah grabbed her secure phone and dialed Rebecca directly. Rebecca, you need to evacuate the aircraft right now. Don't ask questions, just get everyone off the plane immediately. Sarah, what's happening? The tower just ordered us to. Rebecca, listen to me carefully. There's an aircraft approaching the airport that poses an immediate threat. Get the passengers off through the jet bridge and into the terminal. Then follow airport emergency evacuation procedures through the Tactical Operations Center's windows. Sarah could see the distant smoke trails as F-16s from Buckley Air Force Base scrambled to intercept the unidentified aircraft. But she knew they were too far away to make the intercept before the hostile aircraft reached the airport. Colonel Harrison, she called. What's the status on Air Force One? Airborne from the alternate location 60 seconds ago, Harrison replied. Protocol 7 was successful. They're clear of the threat zone. Sarah felt a moment of relief before the tactical situation demanded her full attention again. The approaching aircraft had just appeared on radar as it climbed above the terrain masking altitude, and what she saw made her blood run cold. That's not a civilian aircraft, she announced, studying the radar signature. It's a modified military fighter, probably an F-16 with external fuel tanks for extended range. Agent Vasquez looked up from her evacuation coordination. How is that possible? All military aircraft are accounted for. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities until a terrible realization struck her. What if it's not a current military aircraft? What if someone acquired a decommissioned fighter and modified it for this operation? The implications were staggering. A decommissioned F-16 wouldn't appear in current military tracking systems, could be operated by someone with legitimate fighter pilot training, and would have the performance capabilities to execute a sophisticated attack despite being decades old. Her secure phone rang with the electronically distorted voice again. Major Mitchell, you have approximately 4 minutes to prevent a catastrophe. Who are you? Sarah demanded. Someone who's been trying to prevent this attack for months. The aircraft approaching your airport is being flown by Captain Derek Thompson, formerly of the 56th Fighter Wing. He was discharged 3 years ago following a psychological evaluation, but he retained his flight certifications. Sarah frantically searched military databases for Thompson's record. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're the only person in position to stop him. Thompson knows standard military intercept procedures. He'll evade the F-16s coming from Buckley. But he doesn't know you're involved in the response. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. You've been feeding him information about standard Air Force responses while feeding us information about his capabilities. I've been playing both sides to prevent exactly what's about to happen. Thompson believes he's executing a patriotic mission to expose weaknesses in civilian aviation security. He doesn't realize he's being manipulated by foreign operatives who want him to create maximum civilian casualties. Sarah looked at the tactical display showing Thompson's aircraft now less than 3 minutes from Denver International. What do you want me to do? Talk to him. Pilot to pilot. He'll recognize your call sign. You two served in the same operational theater in Afghanistan. Sarah's hands were already moving to the radio controls. Derek Thompson, this is Major Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix. I need you to respond immediately. Static filled the channel for several seconds before a familiar voice replied. Phoenix? Jesus, Phoenix, is that really you? It's me, Derek. I need you to listen very carefully. You're being manipulated. The people who convinced you to execute this mission are not American patriots. They're foreign operatives using you to create civilian casualties. That's not true, Phoenix. I'm exposing security weaknesses. To protect American lives. Sarah could hear the desperation and confusion in Thompson's voice, the sound of someone who had been psychologically manipulated over months or years. Derek, I'm looking at radar tracking of your approach. You're heading directly toward a gate with 157 civilians aboard an aircraft. That's not exposing security weaknesses, that's mass murder. Channel went silent except for the sound of Thompson's breathing. Sarah pressed her advantage. Derek, remember Afghanistan. Remember why we flew those missions. We were protecting innocent people, not targeting them. The person who convinced you to do this has turned you into the enemy we used to fight against. Phoenix, I can't stop now. They have my family. If I don't complete the mission, they'll kill my wife and daughter. Sarah felt her heart break for her former colleague while her tactical mind processed options. Derek, give me the coordinates where your family is being held. We have federal agents who can extract them while you abort this mission. I don't have coordinates, Phoenix. I don't even know if they're still alive. Through the Tactical Operations Center's windows, Sarah could see the distant speck of Thompson's aircraft approaching the airport. Emergency vehicles were racing across the tarmac, and passengers were evacuating through every available terminal exit. Derek, she said, her voice carrying all the authority and compassion she could muster, I need you to trust me one more time. The way you trusted me when we were windmen over Kandahar. Phoenix, I remember. You saved my life when I took ground fire and lost navigation. That's right. I talked you home when your systems failed. I'm talking you home now, Derek. But this time, home means landing at Peterson Air Force Base and surrendering to federal authorities who will help you find your family. Silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Thompson's voice returned, broken and exhausted. Phoenix, they told me you were dead. They said you died in a civilian aircraft accident years ago. Sarah realized the depth of the psychological manipulation Thompson had endured. Derek, I'm very much alive and I'm going to help you get through this. But first, you need to change course immediately and proceed to Peterson for landing. Phoenix, if I land at Peterson, they'll court-martial me for treason. Derek, if you continue toward Denver International, I'll have to authorize F-16s to shoot you down to protect civilian lives. Don't make me give that order. The tactical display showed Thompson's aircraft beginning a slight turn away from the airport. Sarah held her breath as she watched the course change develop. Phoenix, I'm changing course for Peterson. But I need you to promise me something. What's that, Derek? Promise me you'll help find my family. You have my word as an officer and as your friend. As Thompson's aircraft turned toward Peterson Air Force Base, Sarah coordinated with air traffic control to clear a landing corridor while federal agents prepared to take him into protective custody. The immediate threat to Denver International was over, but the larger questions about who had orchestrated the entire operation remained unanswered. Colonel Harrison approached her as she completed the coordination. Phoenix, outstanding work. You just prevented what could have been one of the worst aviation disasters in American history. Sarah looked out at Denver International Airport, where normal operations were slowly resuming and passengers were being allowed back to their gates. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. All passengers safe. You saved our lives. How did you know? As federal agents began the complex process of unraveling the international conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in creating multiple aviation disasters, Sarah Mitchell realized that her journey from Air Force Major to commercial flight attendant and back to military tactician had prepared her for exactly this moment. The woman who had served coffee and managed passenger complaints for 8 years had just coordinated one of the most complex aviation security operations in American history. And she had done it by remembering that whether in a fighter cockpit or an airline cabin, her fundamental mission had always been the same: protecting innocent lives. Agent Vasquez, Sarah said as she prepared to return to her civilian role. I think it's time for me to get back to my flight. My passengers have been waiting long enough. As she walked back toward gate B12, Sarah Mitchell Major, Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, smiled at the thought of returning to her quiet life as a flight attendant. But she now knew that some responsibilities never truly end. They just wait for the moment when they're needed most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.